Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen Rouse, and it's my pleasure as CEO of Water Research Australia, the new custodian of the Australian Water School, to welcome you all back. I'm also delighted to see that some of Water RA's members have now signed up to the Water School, so welcome to you too. Water RA has been a successful hub for collaboration and innovation in the water sector for more than a decade, with a proven track record of driving many of the nation's water solutions through collaborative research. The Australian Water School also has a proud history of supporting innovation in the water industry through its high calibre technical training and professional development. So we're excited to be the new custodians of the Australian Water School so that we can ensure it continues to build capacity and capability across all aspects of water management. At Water RA, we're committed to industry-designed professional development and training to upskill and to engage leading thinkers in the water sector globally. We look forward to hearing soon from some of our expert presenters, Mark Babister, Monique Retallick and Krey Price. So with no further ado, let's get underway. I'm going to pass you straight over to Krey, who will introduce our presenters, their topics, and will also be with you to moderate the question and answer session. So welcome everybody, and thanks, Krey.
Thanks, Karen. We are excited to be launching under the new banner our inaugural webinar. So we've had a number of these in the past through the Australian Water School with huge success, I think, in terms of the number of views and attendees. And really what it's all about, though, is collaboration. And so look across the globe at the attendees. No surprise that with a topic like Australian rainfall and runoff kicking this one off, that we've got mostly attendees in Australia, but look around the rest of the world as well. There are lots of other places where Australian guidelines are put into place as well and put into practice. So welcome to everybody who's attending. Now, today we are very excited to have Mark Babister and Monique Retallick from WMAwater on board. Anybody familiar with ARR is going to have heard those names before, editors, authors. You'll know their qualifications. That's something that we've been very excited to have them kicking this thing off for Water RA. And we do want to hear from them as soon as possible. But before we dive into it, I wanted to follow up on a previous webinar that we had, which was covering rain on grid. And it's very relevant to what we're going to be covering today with the ARR Data Hub. So before we dive straight into Mark's presentation, let me just share my screen real quick. This is really for the benefit of about 300 or 400 people that sent emails after one of our webinars last year requesting a spreadsheet that was just kind of a little gimmicky spreadsheet I put together first and put a little more effort into it now to be able to release it. You all get to be the beta testers for this one. So if you can see my screen here, I'm just going to pull up a link here. This is a website, surfacewater.biz/frequency. I'll paste that into the chat line or into the Q&A line as well. This is just a method that has been in frequent use in the United States for quite a while, and also TP108 in New Zealand for those who are familiar with those methods. In taking kind of duration independent storms, taking a storm and taking every single frequency that's involved in that storm, every highest intensity that's involved with every duration, and building a single synthetic storm out of it. It's not a storm that's ever going to happen, but it's kind of a worst case that's going to test your whole system. So if you're running a rain on grid model and you want to put one of these on top of it, there's a spreadsheet right here. If you go to that link, there's a download link here that's going to take you to a WeTransfer. It's only going to work for another couple of days. So if you're going to grab that, grab it soon. And what it'll do then, I'll pull up the spreadsheet here. It's going to take you into a kind of an interface that's got some instructions up at the top on the first tab, and then you'll see this thing paste from BOMIFD. Now that's something that Monique's going to walk you through in a little more detail. I'll show you a couple of links here, what you're going to do first. If you've got a catchment that you've already delineated, for example, here I've got one. This is Brisbane. Here's Gold Creek on the Brisbane River, which we've used for quite a few of our training courses, and this will be our example that we're going to be using in our upcoming GIS course as well. Once you have something delineated, whether you've done it through ArcHydro or through any other HEC-HMS or any other system that you might have used to delineate your catchment, if you've got that as a shapefile, you can then take that shapefile into the ARR Data Hub, and you can upload it. I'll show you the link here. And again, this is something that Monique will walk you through as well. You'll take this, the shapefile, upload it to the ARR Data Hub, and when you grab it, you'll see where you're at in the world, and you'll be able to come down here, click on your BOM IFDs, and this is the button right here. This is the key button. Once you click on that button right there, it's going to take you to a spreadsheet, a CSV file that you can download. Copy this whole thing. I'll just copy that right now and paste it into my spreadsheet. And once you've done that, I'll paste it right here. And once we've updated that, we can enter the losses. And again, I'm covering this fairly quickly, but these instructions are all on that website that I've provided. And once you do that, you'll have these frequency storms, whether it's front-loaded, middle-loaded, for different durations, 1 hour, 3 hours, 6 hour, I think all the way up to 72 hours we've gone here. And what you'll do then is take these numbers right there, and I can take this and copy it and paste it into whatever spreadsheet you're going to use, whether it's 2Flow or HEC-RAS or anything like that for a rain on grid assessment. Now, what we're going to hear today is a lot more detailed than that. And it's going to be for specific design items at one node. This kind of a method where you just blanket putting a frequency storm on top of everything is handy for areas where, for example, you want to max out every single culvert along a 10-kilometer roadway, and each of them has varying catchment sizes, and you just want to max them all out, whether they've got a small return or area time of concentration or a long time of concentration. If you want to max them all out, it's just a first pass. I wouldn't substitute anything else on the Monte Carlo methods and other things we're going to hear about today, but I did want to put that out there for those who had requested it previously. So I don't want to take any more time than that. I'll stop my share. Let's turn this thing. We're 10 minutes into it now. We want to make sure we leave enough time for questions afterwards. I'm excited to hear from Mark and Monique. So Mark, you can feel free to share your screen now, and let's dive straight into it. Keep those questions coming on the Q&A line, and we'll try to get to those as we do the handoffs. So thank you for that.
So thanks for that, Krey. I'll get started now. So what I want to do is talk about today is 3 parts of ARR. We've got a diverse audience, and I want to make sure there's something for everyone, but I also want to make sure some of the key things, learnings we've had along the way and messages that we probably didn't publicise that well during the ARR rollout are reinforced with people. So I'll start off with a bit of a general bit on ARR. Lots of people know about ARR, so I'll keep that short. We'll look at the Data Hub. Monique's going to do that, but we also want people to understand with the Data Hub which parts on the Data Hub you should absolutely use all the time, and which bits you might have local information which you would replace instead of using on the Data Hub, because it's on the Data Hub doesn't mean you might not have better data. And last of all, I want to look at temporal patterns and ensemble methods and why we've done it, and some of the things that, a lot of the questions I get asked and things that confuse people. So first up briefly on ARR, we're in our 4th edition. The first edition was in 58, and we had one in 1977, one in 87, and a bit of an update in 1999. And so we've got a long history of improving our techniques, and nothing is static. And that's something we really wanted to emphasize with this edition. Things will improve, technology will improve, people will come up with smart methods better than we have. And we always need to move on to what is a good tested method. It's not static. So what are the big changes in practice? Well, the biggest one really is we've moved to Ensemble and Monte Carlo approaches to better capture variability. And that's one of the things I want to talk about today, and some of the reasons why. We've moved away from simple burst methods, but there is a place for those, like Krey showed in his spreadsheet. If you're doing rapid assessment, I sometimes use a very similar technique as my first pass. I wouldn't use it for the detailed design, but if I want to scope the extent of the problem or where the problem areas are, it's really powerful. The rational method is something we've used for a long time, but we have to move away from it, and for several reasons. One, because there's no data or evidence in Australia. We'd love to use the rational method, but we don't have much data. So we're looking at methods where we do have data and we know they work. And another thing is that we've got is the RFFE method. It is a method which will give you an estimate in most of Australia with really minimal work. It's not hard to use and it's quick. It's got some pretty big confidence limits, but you should always think about using it. I'm not going to talk about it in detail today, but it is really less than a minute's work for anybody on this seminar to find a place in Australia or a catchment size and get an estimate. The other big things are we've got climate change in ARR. I'm hoping it'll be surpassed by more local detailed information. We've got some broad brush climate change figures that people can use because that is a big thing we need to start factoring into our designs, and blockage of structures. Previously, blockage was largely ignored or maybe get sensitivity testing, but it wasn't built into the design. We now recognise that we should be incorporating blockage into the design, and we've got a technique. It's not based on a huge amount of data, but it is based on the limited amount of data. A couple of things about the document. You can download it, it's free, and it's Creative Commons. And if you don't know what Creative Commons means, it means you can reuse it with attribution. You can take any figure, any equation, any piece of text, as long as you acknowledge where you've got it from and stick it in your own report, guideline, document, manual, whether you're a council, a state government in Australia or overseas. All of it is free to use as long as you give, say where you got it from. Now, not going to go into the structure too much, but it's structured in 9 books and there's 53 chapters. We think this is a very logical way to lay out the document, and I hope it is, because we spent a lot of time arguing and discussing it and coming up with this structure, but it should be very easy to find the section you need. So another key thing about Australian rainfall and runoff in this update is we tried to be as transparent as possible and present all the data we've used and all the techniques we've used and how we got to those endpoints. On a big project, there's always a few things that slip through the cracks, but all the reports are online. And there's also 2 really useful supporting documents that I refer people to. And both of them have got broad application in Australia and outside Australia. There's the 2D modelling guidelines in urban and rural floodplains. Now that was written about 7 years ago, but there's a lot of good practical advice on doing 2D hydraulic modelling. And it's not written in very complicated speak. It's a very approachable document. And even if you're not going to do modelling yourself, but you're commissioning a study or you're trying to understand what somebody's written, it will explain all of the key parts in really easy to approach language. And if you're doing some modelling by yourself and you don't have a mentor, it's very easy to make mistakes. This is a document that not quite make up for a mentor, but will provide you a lot of guidance. I'd really encourage people to look at it. The other one's on Monte Carlo simulations. It's a little bit more technical. It's by Professor Rory Nathan, but we're using Monte Carlo techniques more and more for our complex hydrologic problems. And if you want to get your head around these techniques and understand them, this is the place to go to. And even if you just want a simple understanding, there's a really good section at the end where Rory presents how to do a Monte Carlo technique that you could implement in Excel without too much trouble. And obviously there's the project reports. Some other key changes in ARR is we've basically updated every single input. And for things like the rainfall, we've moved from just using the Bureau's gauges to using all of the gauges in Australia with the Bureau accessed from all the agencies in Australia. Something like aerial reduction factors. In the previous edition, they were based on US data. Now they're based on Australian data. Losses, we had some pretty broad brush jurisdictional advice. We've now got some national advice. There probably is there's probably some grounds for improving this, but at least we've now got national advice and equations that you can use anywhere. And we've done the same on base flow. We have some default advice all throughout Australia that you can use if you need to understand base flow. You can probably, on a detailed study, come up with some better values yourself, but if you just want some quick informative values, we've got that. And then there's temporal patterns. We've significantly changed there, and that's going to be later in the presentation. What I'm going to now is hand over to Monique, and she's going to give you a presentation of the Data Hub and how it works.
Okay, so we're just going to go to the ARR Data Hub's website. So the web address is data.arr.software.org. And this is what it'll look like when you get onto the landing page. It gives you a map of Australia and you can move the location around here to put it wherever you're interested in. I'm going to move it up on the north coast of New South Wales there. If I just zoom out, you can see where, for people from around the world, you can see where I am in Australia. And it allows you to zoom into the marker and see if you've got the right location. So I've gone a bit too far inland, so I'll move it down on the coast here. Okay, so it's got your location in lat long here, so you can also confirm you've got the right location. You can upload a shapefile as well if you'd like to do it that way. And so I'm just going to select all parameters here. So it'll select ARFs, losses, temporal patterns, pre-burst and climate change factors. It won't select the base flow because the base flow is to an outlet. So you have to do that separately. We're doing to catchment centroid. So we'll just submit our query here and hopefully it'll take us to the results page. Okay. So it'll come up with a map here of our location, and we've got the ability to click on and off some regions here to make sure we're getting the results for the right zone, to see if we're on the edge of a zone and what grid cell is being selected. So if you're on the edge of the zone, you might want to move across into the other zone and get those results as well, if you want to try different temporal patterns. So it'll tell you here what river basin you're in. That's a good check to make sure you're in the right location. So I'm in the Bellinger River here. It'll give you the ARF parameters, which is good because it's quite a complex formula there, but hopefully your software package will handle that one for you. It's also got your loss values. Now, because we're in New South Wales, we've got this error, this little warning here to tell us that New South Wales has a New South Wales specific procedure and to check what you should be doing there. We've also got the temporal pattern zone. We're in East Coast South, and it'll allow us to download that as a zip file, but your software package will probably already download that or the aerial patterns for you. You can use this button here to check the BOM IFD and make sure you're in, it'll pre-fill the information, but it won't get the information for you. You have to then click submit. We've also got a number of pre-burst depths and ratios. So we've got the median, the 10%, the 25%, 75%, and 90%. And typically we use the median value. It then brings up the climate change factors for your location with the number as well as the converted percentage. And because we're in New South Wales, we've got the probability neutral burst initial loss at the bottom here, but we won't go into detail on that today. And then you have the ability to download as a text file or PDF or a JSON file. We recommend that you include a copy of this at the back of your report so somebody in the future can reproduce this. Okay, well, I'll hand back to Mark.
Thanks for that, Monique. Okay, so one of the key things we didn't talk about enough when we rolled out Australian Rainfall is on the Data Hub, you can get values for anything that you need for your standard inputs for hydrology, but some of them are quite reliable and robust, and some of them are a bit more broad brush regional predictors that you might be able to get better information yourself. So things like the IFD, the design rainfalls, the Bureau's gone to extensive effort on that, and it's very unlikely that you're going to come up with a better estimate of the IFD. The same with the error reduction factors. That was a large amount of work, and you would have to do a very extensive regional study to come up with something similar. So you would use those values. The temporal patterns, they've been selected. There might be one or two problems with one patterns, but generally you would use those patterns, and the same with the pre-burst. But then we come down to some of the other things like the losses. We have some regional predictor equations in there, but they are regional predictor equations based on a really small data set. So you might be able to do a lot better by looking at the losses you've got on local catchments that you've calibrated. So just because it's on the Data Hub doesn't mean there might not be better information you can derive yourself. The same with climate change factors. We've got some national factors based on a whole lot of zones throughout Australia, but we're hoping that as we move forward and the research increases, there will be regional and local factors in different states and different jurisdictions that will be more reliable and robust. And the same with base flow. We've got some default values, really rigorously derived, but you might have a local gauge and you can do a better job than what's on the Data Hub. So don't treat everything on the Data Hub as absolute certainty. Take a look at where it's come from and treat it appropriately. And that's one of my key messages for today. Now, the other thing I really want to talk about is temporal patterns. I get a lot of questions about temporal patterns and pre-burst and how they work and why we've changed things. So I thought it was worthwhile emphasizing a little bit of these. So we've moved, and this is probably one of the biggest changes and one we've got the most feedback from on ARR, and some of it's been a little bit robust. People don't like change, is because in Australia, we've got very variable storm mechanisms and a whole continent. We really need to consider the variability of storms. And after the depth of rainfall, temporal patterns in most of Australia is the biggest driver of the peak flow you get. There are some places where it's not, where the losses are very high, but in most of Australia, a different temporal pattern will get you a very different flow. And there is no one magic or typical or representative temporal pattern for every catchment. The other thing I really wanted to talk about is pre-burst rainfall, which is a new concept in ARR. It's rainfall that occurs before the burst, and it's really important that we understand this, and so our techniques relate to how real storms occur. So Ensemble hydrology is not a great change from what we've done for over 30 or 40 years. In the past, we had design rainfall, we had a single temporal pattern, we had a hydrologic model, and we would run it and we get a flow. Well, all we've really done now is say, hey, one temporal pattern's not enough, you need to use an ensemble. A very carefully chosen ensemble. It's not just 10 random patterns. Those 10 patterns have been picked carefully. And you run it through 10 times through your hydrologic model, doesn't matter which one you use, and you get 10 results, and we recommend you take the mean. Or for practical cases, you just take the event that's just above the mean, and you use that for some of your more detailed assessment and work. That's not a big change. These models typically take seconds or less to run. So running 10 is not that complicated, but there's been quite a few people who are not happy about this, but I'm going to try and explain to you why we need to do this. The first thing that's often misunderstood by people is the difference between a storm and a burst. And this is really important. This is in 87, so it's not new, but I regularly have people who don't quite understand the distinction. So real rainfall occurs as a complete storm, while design methods typically use a burst. And a burst here is this bit over here. If you can see my mouse in the lighter blue, it is the intense part of the storm that's responsible for the majority of the flooding. But before that critical burst, we will have pre-burst rainfall in some places. And it could be just a little bit of rainfall, or it could be a lot. And there are places in Australia where it can be an awful lot. Now, most of the time, that pre-burst rainfall will just interact with your initial loss and won't create runoff. But in some places in Australia and in some storms, that pre-burst rainfall will generate runoff. It might not cause serious flooding, but it might fill the creek up to the bank level before your burst turns up. And the other thing we've got is the rainfall after the burst. We're a lot less interested in that, but there are a few specific applications where you're trying to get the recession drawdowns right and things like that, where you might need to consider that as well. So always understand that there's a burst that we often use in our design methods, and real storms could have more rainfall either side of that. And that's really important when you think about losses and how they interact with a storm. So why did we change things? Well, we had a much richer database of rain gauges to draw from. In 87, there were 14 long-term pluvies around Australia. Now we've got a lot of pluvie information. We don't cover the whole continent. You can see there's a few gaps in Western Australia over here, but we've got a much broader rain gauge network that we were able to use. And we took data from every single one of these rain gauges as part of our temporal pattern work. The next thing is we've got regions. We had regions in ARR 87. We've got new regions. These are based on some work by CSIRO. We were looking for regions that made sense, and we came up with these regions. They were originally used for CSIRO, looking at climate change effects, not just for flooding, but for temperature and just general rainfall and other factors. But we've used them for Australian rainfall and runoff. We did make a slight change where we put a separate region in for the Pilbara because there's a very specific interest in what's going on in the Pilbara from the mining sector. So in Australia, for temporal patterns, you're in a particular region. And we also got a little bit of feedback from people who are right on the boundaries. And that if you're on the boundary, have a look at the adjoining one and see if it makes a difference. Does it make 1% difference, or does it make 10 or 15% difference? Because maybe you want to do both and take the average of those two. The other thing about storms is, and I've put 2 storms up here, and I've pasted these out of Australian Rainfall and Runoff. Very different storms can have the same IFD characteristics. What we have is 2 storms from Observatory Hill, if my memory is correct. And you can see on this line, there's a blue one and a red one, and they actually, over the orange part of the burst showing in these 2 figures, have nearly identical characteristics. But what we can see on the top one, it's got an enormous amount of rainfall before it, while the bottom one has a little bit of rainfall after it. So the blue one tapers off, while the red one actually has rainfalls that are quite significant over 48 hours. And this is something you need to always understand. All the storms will be different. Some of them will have a lot of rainfall before them, and some of them won't. And this is probably what causes a lot of flooding on parts of the east coast of Australia, particularly in New South Wales. We get what's called east coast lows. And if you look at the flood record, these are really common in the flood record. They dominate it completely. And what you get is 2 days or 3 days of rainfall with some pretty reasonable bursts. And then usually when it causes severe flooding, a big burst at the end when the catchment's soaked, creeks are already probably running at the bank level, and that causes our flooding. And we're finding more and more that they're absolutely crucial. They're what causes major flooding in New South Wales, but also in other parts of the country. So storms can have very different characteristics, and all of these characteristics affect flooding. So we moved to an ensemble of patterns. We moved to 10. We probably should have moved to more, but 10 was a pretty big change from 1. And they weren't just 10 random patterns. We put a set here from 3 hours from one of the bins we've downloaded off the Data Hub. And what we've done is we've ranked them from where the majority of the rainfall occurs. So these first ones are what we call front-loaded, where we have a lot of rainfall at the start and not much at the end. And unfortunately, they're all at slightly different scales, so you might have to zoom in and have a bit of a look. But as we move through these storms towards the end, we get to the bottom ones at the end, which we call backloaded. Now, they're not as common as front-loaded or mid-loaded storms. They're about 20% of the time. It varies where you are in the country. But what we do know is if you're building a retarding basin, it'll work really well usually with a front-loaded storm, and it'll work nowhere near as well with a back-loaded storm. And that's one of the reasons why we want people to run an ensemble, particularly with things with storage like basins, because if you run an average storm or average pattern, not that there is any such thing, you won't know what's going to happen in these backloaded storms, which are the ones where you won't get anywhere near the performance you've expected. And running an ensemble means that you're testing a much better range. And these 10 have been carefully picked to try and represent the broad characteristics. And if we look at some of the other characteristics, this is where these 10 came from. And you'll notice in this zone, which covers the east coast of New South Wales from the Queensland border down to a bit past Sydney, we've picked storms from a whole lot of locations. We haven't picked them from all one. We've tried to spread them out geographically. And so they're broadly representative of the region. But likewise, if you look at where they occur in time, we haven't picked the same storm 10 times because that would defeat the purpose of the ensembling patterns. We've tried to pick 10 distinct storms. And you'll notice we've got one in the 1950s, and then we've got to range them over the time, including some more recent storms. And this data is available on the Data Hub. This graph and the graph I just showed, you can do that yourself for any Data Hub values because all of the metadata is there, when the storm occurred, what the gauge number is, what the latitude and longitude is. And I really encourage people to do this plot and the previous plot, particularly for what's critical, because maybe you're in a small part of the zone where there was no storms nearby and you need to know that. Pre-burst. Now, completely new concept in ARR, and it's part of this transition from just looking at burst to sort of making it a little bit more like a complete storm. We're in a transition phase, I guess. And it's really important for losses. If you just looked at bursts for design and you looked at complete storms for your calibration, you couldn't really translate losses from calibration of real storms to bursts in your design. But when you take into account pre-burst, you can do that. It varies significantly through the country. There are some places where basically the storm is the complete burst, and Adelaide's a really good example, where when we looked at storms and pre-burst, it was pretty much a waste of time because it varied basically between 0 and 3 mils. And the uncertainty in all the other factors means what's happening in the pre-burst, whether it's 1 or 0, 1 or 3 mils, doesn't make any difference. But there are parts along the east coast of Australia, particularly in parts of Queensland, New South Wales, but other parts of Australia as well, where pre-burst can be quite significant. And in those locations, you need to take that into account. Now, we give you a median value or a 50 percentile on the data hub, and for most locations, you just use that. But for some of these locations with extreme ranges, you probably need to look at the distribution as well. Usually the 10% everywhere in Australia will be 0 or close to it, and 25% often is close to 0 as well. But the 90% can be quite high. So I guess the other thing I really wanted to talk about pre-burst is how much it varies between storms. And that's why you really need to, in these high pre-burst zones, look at the distribution. Once again, here we have 2 of the temporal patterns we used in ARR, and I've just looked at how much pre-burst occurred between them. Now we've picked 2 extreme ones just to line up that they're out of the same bin, they're in the same region, but they're probably different storms in time and a fair way away from each other. One has a huge amount of rainfall preceding it, while the other one has basically nothing, but it has a fair bit of follow-up rain. I could have put all 10 up. Most of them would have been in the middle and similar, so I've picked the 2 extreme ones. But when pre-burst is extreme, you probably need to consider the distribution. Now, that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. I guess we move over to questions now. And I guess, has there been any questions, Monique, on the chat line that we should address first?
Yeah, we've had a lot of questions about temporal patterns popping up. One of the questions was, could you explain the difference between aerial and point temporal patterns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So those patterns that I showed, they're point patterns. We use them on small catchments up to about 75 square kilometres. And they're based on the rainfall that's recorded at a single point. But when a catchment gets bigger, a point pattern has usually a little bit more variability than you see on a catchment scale. And so the aerial patterns have been worked out by looking at the average temporal pattern from a large number of gauges over a whole lot of real catchments or synthetic catchments based on real catchments put on a map of Australia in the different zones. And so if your catchment's 100 square kilometres, or from say 75 to 150 or something, you would use the 100 square kilometre aerial pattern. It's an ensemble of those, and once again we provide all the metadata. We tell you where the centroid of where we derived it from. It's based on real data, but generally with an aerial pattern, and I use the word generally very carefully there, you'll get a slightly more lower response because it won't have as much variability as a point pattern. And you'll see that if you look at the radar. You might see at a particular point, the radar during the storm goes up and down and it's quite intense, while over the entire catchment, on average, there's a little bit less variability. It's closer to being uniform, but never uniform. And small catchments use the point patterns, big catchments use the aerial patterns. We don't provide aerial patterns over the full range. Occasionally, you'll get a catchment that's a little bit outside the range. Very unusual. If you don't have an aerial one available, use a point pattern.
We've had quite a few questions about when you're using 10 temporal patterns, is it the mean or the median that you take? So can you clear that one up for once and for all, Mark?
I don't think I'm ever going to clear this one up, but look, you want a measure of central tendency, and that's what the mean and the median do. They tell you what's the middle result or what's the typical result. The mean and the median work differently. If your data set's uniformly distributed, they'll basically give you the same number. If it's highly skewed and distorted, then the median's often a better measure of central tendency. But we recommend, for simplicity, you use the mean, and I would just pick the storm just above the mean. But I regularly look at the mean and the median. and make an informed decision, because that's telling you whether the distributions. And we suggest you use box plots, not because to look at the distribution of patterns. I haven't put any up on this presentation because we've got time constraints. So I'm not going to clear this up completely. I'm going to say just use the mean most of the time. But if you've got a good reason, no one's going to mark you down for using the median, particularly if you're doing direct rainfall or you're using a hydraulic model. It's very hard on edge cells to work out what the mean value is when half the cells are dry and the other half are wet, but you can work out where the 5th and 6th wet cell is. So we do understand there are location times when you need to use the median.
All right, thanks, Mark. I think one thing, because there's a lot of questions coming through, I do want to just highlight that a lot of you will be more interested in further detail, additional detail to what we're seeing today. And we are going to have a poll at the end. If you do leave the presentation, you'll see a poll at the end, whether you're going to be interested in additional training. And if so, what are the topics? I already see 20 questions or 30 questions or so. Now another one coming in. Monique's been frantically answering some. We're not going to get to everything, but we are going to be running a training course. Mark and Monique have graciously volunteered to do that. But we don't know exactly what content would be covered and how long it would be. That's up to you. So fill in that poll and let's try and get to as many of these questions as we can, understanding that when we answer them, they go off into the answered column and then you don't see them again and they don't get the chance to get upvoted. But Con, hey, welcome to the presentation. Good to hear from you again. Con's got the #1 upvoted question, 20 responses here that want to know. ARR has a lot of focus on rural catchments, and when can we see more simple procedures for the urban catchments? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so this is a bit of feedback we've had over the last year or two as well about the urban book, and some people are saying these methods are too complicated for urban catchments. I would suggest that urban catchments are more complicated than rural catchments, and that's where the investment is in society. That's where we build our houses. That's where we do most of the investment, and it's where infrastructure interferes with people trying to live in houses or go to work. And for that reason, we've tried to suggest that simple procedures are probably not the grandest idea in urban catchments. Now, you might use a simple procedure to do some basic pipe and pip design, but most of the time now, our emphasis has changed significantly in urban areas. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was a big obsession with pits, pipes, and getting water in the drain so people didn't have to step over the gutter and get wet. But now the public's and our attention is really focused on people don't want water in their houses. They don't want people being washed away. And that risk to people's homes and lives and cars needs to be looked at properly in urban areas. And we need these more complex techniques. Probably all right for your pipes, but really important for designing urban infrastructure. And one of the facts that you might want to keep in mind, half the people in Australia who die in floods do it while driving their cars. And most of those people voluntarily drive into floodwaters thinking they'll get through. So it's really important we design our urban systems in a safe way.
Yeah, thanks for that one. Now, one of the things I wanted to just quick touch on, it covers about 3 or 4 of these questions on rain on grid modeling, which is becoming more and more prevalent, but to me is a bit problematic, and I'd be interested in Mark and Monique's perspective on this as well, in that it's using a whole different mechanism to, turn rainfall into runoff. And one of the things some people have asked about the pre-burst in rain on grid modeling, and sometimes when you use a single pattern for the entire catchment, yeah, that is a bit of a stretch sometimes. Sometimes it's all we've got. But one thing I wanted to highlight is that the terrain that you use, if you're going to do rain on grid modeling, the terrain becomes absolutely crucial. Your model's never going to be better than the terrain. And if your terrain is crap, then the model is crap. So one of the things that you got to watch out for, especially when you're looking at pre-bursts and losses and what kind of losses to apply. Sometimes I'll take a rain on grid model and I'll just run rain on it until my runoff equals the rainfall rate. And then I'll compare the 2 volumes. How much volume of water did I bring in? And how much volume was stored in all of these little storage areas. Sometimes it's real. There's real storage areas, real basins that are part of your terrain. And sometimes it's just artificial because your terrain is garbage and it wasn't filtered correctly. And it's storing water all over the place. And you're not going to get any runoff until those are filled. And sometimes you want to look at that and compare. How much volume did you lose just in your terrain? and you do have to go back and look at your pre-bursts. You do have to go back and look at your losses and determine, are you using appropriate losses if you're going to go with rain on grid? So there's about 3 or 4 questions that came up on that. Any warnings, red flags, things like that, Mark, Monique, anything that you want to highlight about applying rain on grid and whether it's going to be more prevalent in future ARR guidance?
Yeah, look, I think you've answered most of the question there. The first thing I do when I get asked to review a rainfall on grid model is I look at how much rainfall runs off at the bottom of the model, because that should be the rainfall minus the losses. But 90% of the time, it's less because people haven't gone back and checked, just like you mentioned, about all this noise in the terrain, depression storage. Now, some of it's real, but a lot of it's not. The definition of losses is rainfall that doesn't turn into runoff. It's not magic stuff that we take off the rainfall. It's rainfall that doesn't turn into runoff. So it should run off at the bottom of your model unless it's going to a dam or something else in your model. So always check. There's some good guidance in the New South Wales guidance guideline on how to do some modelling that shows you some of those checks, and it shows you what happens if you don't do those checks. And you need to adjust your losses for this depression storage because some of it, as you said, is artificial noise.
Yes, thanks. And while you're talking about losses, let's just quick do the next upvoted question, which was how the Data Hub's initial loss and continuing losses were estimated.
Yeah, so some really good work was done by some people, Peter Hill and a team of people. He was at Jacobs at the time, and now he's on his own firm called Hark with quite a good group there. They looked at 35 catchments in Australia, which is not a very big sample. And there were certain size catchments, basically about 50 square kilometres. And they looked at how much rainfall didn't turn into runoff in a simple way. And they fitted predictor equations to those. Now, there's only 35 catchments. They're in 4 zones. And so it's pretty broad brush stuff. And that's why if you do a local calibration, you calibrate to 4 events on a catchment, probably you can learn more about the losses from that local study than you can get off that broad brush data hub thing values. But, you know, they're a really good starting point. You should always check them, see how they compare. We're now moving in a couple of the states anyway, to looking at losses in a different way and over a broader area of gauges. What Peter did was based on the sort of the basic theory, but one thing to keep in mind, what losses do in the whole hydrological process, they're the last step. So they're like the painter when you get your house built. He has to paint over every mistake and every bodge in your house. And so they inherit all of the noise and errors from the other techniques. And people often blame losses for models not reproducing flood frequency, but it's probably they just aren't able to compensate for all the other mistakes.
Right. No, thanks
So
for
one
that.
thing I'll add to that, there was a question related to the losses asking about Melbourne specifically. I understand that there is some work underway to update the Melbourne losses the same way as the New South Wales losses have been updated.
Perfect. I think one of the next upvoted ones is more of a comment and maybe a request for the layperson who doesn't understand the terminology that's in ARR. You know, would a simplified version of the guideline? Are you aware of any resources that could be provided, like in an educational kind of a context, to be provided to those who might not understand the terminology that ARR just jumps right into?
That's an interesting question, because one of the jokes we had when we were writing ARR, there was a fair bit of tension between the team about how technical it should be. And a group of us actually pushed for it to make it approachable. So it could have been worse, I guess is my first question, my first answer to the question. And we joked about writing ARR for Dummies, a guide to actually understanding the guide. But it is a bit complicated, and we probably do need a basic outline more for lay people on some of this. And we've had the same thing with some of the terminology as well. So right. I do understand the need, and it could have been worse.
Yeah. Well, here's a question that I've heard asked from one of the like a government stakeholder who says, "Hey, I paid for a study. It was done with ARR 2016 in 2017. Now I see there's ARR 2019. Do I need to go pay for a new study to get it redone?" And I know that's not a simple answer, but how would you respond to that?
No. Look, it is a simple answer. The difference between 16 and 19 is basically we tidied up typos, fixed up references, and there's been one or two minor updates in a few areas. The changes are insignificant in 99.9% of cases. So if don't fund a new study. And my other advice would be if it changes again, wait for the council next door to do a study, work out when they've made the mistakes, and then do yours second. You always wear a bit of pain for being an early adopter, but we always all rush in.
Yeah. Great. Monique, I know you've been frantically answering some questions just on the chat line, and now then they get dismissed, and so not everybody gets to see these. And just keep in mind also that on the YouTube video, people watching the recording will not see these comments. So can you think of anything that you've answered already? I know there's quite a few still to go through, but anything you wanted to highlight from the ones you've answered already?
Yeah, there was a question about the temporal patterns and why we're using design patterns and we should be using historical storms. So I'm not sure that you might have missed that in Mark's presentation, but the 10 patterns we use are based on real storms around the country.
Great. Thanks. And I think there's a couple of other questions then about specific software packages. And one that's been upvoted a bit here also is just, what future changes are we going to be looking at going forward 10 years from now, ARR 2029? Where do you think we're heading? This whole thing with big data, gridded data, massive, storms coming in that are temporally and spatially varying, and you can model them from radar. There's some really cool things. You can see it live on your, on your iPad. You'll walk out there and you can see in 3D, oblique views and, screening around, and you can actually watch in Google Earth the flood come and go. There's some really cool things coming. Where do you see this heading?
Yeah, I think where we're going is like you've described is some of these techniques, they'll adapt a bit, but we will be looking at running large ensembles or continuous streams of synthetic storms through our models. So we'll get a much better idea of what the future will look like with and without climate change. And also that will mean, because we're going to use real storms or synthetic versions of real storms, not just will we get the peak flow right, but we'll start to understand rates of rise and variability and durations of flooding and how long bridges will be closed or roads will be closed. We're already seeing those sort of techniques used on some very high value studies, usually for dams or where there's major evacuation issues, but that will be the future. And so it's not practical a lot of the time to run a large number of storms, but there are studies where I work on when we assess an option, we'll run 20,000 events, and we'll see how each one change, and we'll understand what sort of events does that mitigation strategy work really well on, and which one does it work badly, and which ones do the emergency services really need to look out for, where, say, evacuation routes will be shut, or the combination of flows will mean a very bad outcome. So that's the future, I think.
Monique, any comments on that?
No, nothing extra to add.
Yeah, boy, we if you're looking through, you may want to just pick a few. Mark and Monique, just scroll down. There's 40 questions that are still unanswered. Great, thanks for all these questions coming in. This is awesome to see, but obviously we're going to have to limit this a bit. We will have these questions and your name associated with the question that'll be distributed to the speakers afterwards, and we may be able to respond to you directly in that regard. So, Mark, Monique, I'd invite you to just kind of scroll through there and see, maybe pick 2 or 3 of the 40 that we'll have time to cover, and just see if there's anything that that you think you'd like to cover in the about 3-4 minutes remaining.
So one of the questions was about pre-burst temporal patterns. Yep. And there is no unique pre-burst temporal pattern, but there clearly is an industry need to have some generic ones, and that's something that we want to address, and I hope to see something come out pretty soon. But anything we change from now on will probably not be somebody's good idea. It will be subject to very rigorous testing, and that's probably the other big thing that's changing in the future is we are moving, and I hate the word big data, where most of the changes we've been testing in New South Wales are not tested on 1 or 2 catchments now. They're tested on 180, and they've got to work better on 180 catchments for us to say, well, maybe we should think about this instead of somebody going, I've got this new idea, everybody should adopt it. I've tested it on 1 or 2 catchments.
Cool. Monique, any that jump out at you?
Yeah, so related to that, there's been some questions about using the 50 percentile for the pre-burst and whether that's appropriate. And I guess following on from Mark's comment on the temporal patterns, we have had a few catchments where we've struggled to match flood frequency analysis for very long records using the 50% pre-burst, and we have used the 90% pre-burst in that case. And we've applied a temporal pattern based on the historical storms in the area and different durations of that. So,
great. Oh, thanks for that. I'll get a question here from Ben Coos. Hi, Ben. I hope you're enjoying the presentation. Any other states looking to adopt a similar method like New South Wales has with the OEH requirements for applying probability neutral burst initial losses? How's that?
I can say that I've had a fair few questions from Tony Ladson in Victoria on how we did it. And so I'd suggest that Tony is well on the way to looking at it. But I also think it's probably only a major issue along the coastal strip of New South Wales and Queensland, where you get such a wide variability. There are places in Queensland where the 90% pre-burst could be 300 millimetres. And that's really, you've got enough rainfall to cause a flood, and then you've got a reasonable chance of follow-up flood. Most of Australia, it's probably not a big deal. But we're also doing some work in Tasmania where some of this work will fall out of that as well, and we'll see whether it's relevant in Tasmania.
Thanks. Well, I think we may have to call it there. We'll give you a minute or two for some final comments, but Mark and Monique, just thanks so much for coming on, being willing to host our inaugural launch of the Australian Water School under its new banner. We're excited to see where it's going to head. But again, all you who attended, I mean, over 1,000 people registering for this one. That's great to see. These days, things get very divisive. If you watch the news, I have to just kind of check out sometimes and not even watch it. But, look at the map. We got 1,000 people coming onto these things, everybody wanting to, get water where it's needed to go or keep water where we don't, where it might cause some harm. We're all trying to just do our best. And it's great to see a community like this come together and to interact with you. It's a privilege for me to be able to do this. I know some of you are doing it really tough right now. People going back into lockdown in Melbourne. It's, boy, I appreciate it. I got a son waiting on a heart transplant who just, we'd be isolated by ourselves if people weren't doing these things. We might have to do that for a year or two if people weren't, keeping up on these things, these sacrifices that everybody's making. So we are all lucky. We have jobs. I think most of you on this call who are able to come on to something like Zoom are able to work from home. There's a lot of people who are not. So, we're very fortunate. Let's reach out to those who are not so fortunate in this tough time. So thanks for, during the COVID time, we didn't have anything going on for the Australian Water School, but now we plan to just hit it hard. And every few weeks you'll have a course in HEC-RAS coming up, HEC-HMS, ModFlow, 2Flow. We've got all sorts of courses, webinars that are still going to continue to be free. You'll get a recording of this one, and on the YouTube channel you'll see many more. You can see this list of things going on. In the future, we'll keep populating this list. So thanks so much for all of your comments. I'll turn it back over. Any final closing comments from you, Mark, and then over to Monique?
I did have some, but I've forgotten what I was going to say. So I really haven't got too much to add. Just thanks for the questions. They've been great questions. There was one about safety guidelines as well as cars. I just want to say the University of New South Wales has done some great work on using real cars and how they're washed away in floods. And that is how people die in Australia. So don't drive into floodwaters.
Good point. Monique?
Yeah, just thank you everyone for turning up and stay safe out there.
Appreciate that. Okay. Well, thanks so much, guys. I think we'll call it there. We'll leave this screen up for you for a while. Click on these links, fill out the survey. Some of these things are free coming up. You may as well upskill during this time. And some of the courses I think are of a very good value for the online courses that are coming up as well. Please register for those. And if anybody's interested in sponsorships for these, I mean, right there, you got 1,000 people just registered for this. If any companies are interested in helping to sponsor these things and give us some more technical content and some support that, where we can beef up some of the things that we do, certainly interested, contact the Australian Water School about some of those sponsorships. sponsorship arrangements. So with that, I'll sign off now. And thanks so much. We look forward to hearing from you and interacting more on our future courses and webinars. Thank you.